Okay, hi. We're here today to talk about plugins. I like to call plugins game development's unsung heroes. How many people here have ever used a plugin from the Unity Asset Store? Awesome, quite a few of you. So we're going to tell you today about how you can have some fun and make some money from building plugins. Just to give you a little bit of background, my name is Karen. I've written a few books about video game sound, and I teach game design at the University of Waterloo. This is Alex. He is the CTO and chief problem solver of our company, which is called Ehtonal. We've made a number of plugins, including one called SoundSign for deaf accessible gaming, but Veemix is our first Unity plugin. So we're going to be using Veemix for our examples today. Just to tell you a little bit about it so you understand what it is. Veemix allows a game developer to tag locations inside their game with a series of keywords that the player can then associate those locations when they uncover them with songs from their device. So they're creating a playlist for their game that they can then go and share with other gamers. So they're kind of DJing their game. We have a little teaser video that will explain this better than I can right here. Right now, we're just ending our beta phase. We should be in the Asset Store in a few weeks. We've built right now for iOS, so a lot of our talk today is focusing on iOS, although we're currently building an Android version, and a lot of the main concepts we're talking about today can be used for any platform. So I'll go through a little bit about plugins, about how to plan a plugin. Alex is going to take you through some of the building process of building and developing a plugin, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to sell your plugin. Well, why do people use plugins? The most obvious reason is to help save time and costs. So if you can buy a plugin for 50 bucks that would take you a week or 2 weeks or longer to develop, then why wouldn't you just pony up the money? So it saves a lot of time for developers. It helps to add a lot of functionality really quickly to your game. You can also do all kinds of things that perhaps you didn't know how to do, like Arthur's presentation that we just heard. That would be something very useful if you didn't know how to do advanced GPU processing. And it can offer a lot of quality and options that may be improved upon what you get sort of out of the box from Unity. So as far as developing plugins, a lot of Unity game developers and indie game developers are finding that plugins are a great way to subsidize the cost of building a game. So if your game does really poorly, but you've created some plugins out of that code that you spent time developing, you can actually offset some of the risk and some of the cost for developing a game. It's also a great way to share some of your ideas with the community. So this was one of our motivators for creating Veemix. You know, we had this idea and we thought, well, this is something I want in a game. And we thought, well, why put it in one game when we can get it out there and put it in hundreds or thousands of games? To give you an idea of how much money you can make making plugins, we heard in the keynote on Wednesday that some of the top Asset Store contributors are making as much as $90,000 a month, We did some digging online and came up with a few other numbers. NGUI, which you might be familiar with, it makes approximately $300,000 a year, reportedly, off that plugin. And to give you an idea of offsetting those game development costs, that company, Tasherin Entertainment, built a game called Windward and actually lost $70,000. So they're making much more off the plugin than they are off the game. So I'll just explain a little bit about how to plan out the development of the plugin. Obviously, planning process is going to change depending on how complicated your plugin is. The first step I think you should take in planning a plugin is just to be using Unity and think about, what frustrates you, what could be improved upon as far as your workflow or as far as functionality that you'd like to see, what's missing there that you want to add in. Talk to other game developers. For instance, I read the tweets from the Unity 3D bots, and I find a lot of the developers are having the same problems, and some of those problems could be solved through creating a plugin. So being involved in your local or online game development communities is a great way to see, what people actually are looking for and what you might be able to develop and sell as a plugin. Testing other people's plugins is a great way to understand the workflow of plugins. There's lots of great plugins out there. See how they package it up, how they support it, how they incorporate it into a game. There's lots you can learn from just studying other people's plugins. And I think this is great advice for any kind of business, is either find something new or find something that's been done and do it different and better. You don't necessarily have to have a unique idea. You don't have to wait for that genius idea to come up that nobody's ever done before. You can just take something that's been done and do it different and better. Of course, Apple's kind of made their whole business model off that idea. Something to think about when you're planning out a plugin is that plugins have two markets, unlike a game. So you have both the developer to think about as well as the end user or player. So when you're planning, you have to plan for both of those types of people. They have different needs, different requirements, so there's different things you want to think about there. Plugins also require some kind of support or external tutorial material that games usually, you don't have to be thinking about that with games. So games don't usually come with an instruction book. But with plugins, you have to think about what kind of support, what kind of tutorials can you offer. I'm a huge fan of paper prototyping. This is something I do with students in my game design classes. I find it's always a very useful tool. To give you an example, for instance, last summer I had a class. They built a really beautiful, complex, graphically complex game, and I pretended to play it on paper, and I said, well, how do I pause the game? And they hadn't really thought about how to fit a pause button on their screen. So, but doing it on paper first, they could implement that a lot faster when it comes to programming because now it had all been planned out in advance. So it's a lot cheaper and faster to sort of work out the kinks on paper before you go and develop. And you can also test on users with paper prototypes. So this is something, again, that I do in my classes is I sit them down and we go through, pretending to click on links. And the usefulness of that testing is often, it can't be understated that a lot of users will come up with some great ideas that you hadn't thought of yourself. And it's much easier to implement that when you have it on paper rather than after you've already developed an early version of your product. So related to that then is this idea of avoiding feature creep. So it's very tempting to keep adding more and more features. We have tons of ideas that we want to put into our plugin, but if we were going to put them all in, it might take us 2 more years of development time, and there's just so much cost up front then. But if we think about it in advance and just put out their core idea, and then we can push out add-ons later, that's a much better model for helping the community and getting some feedback and sort of getting that iterative feedback loop with your users. Also, I'm a huge fan of usability or user experience testing. I've never gone through a UX test where I didn't learn something from the users. And I think something that's often overlooked with people who make plugins is to do some user testing with your tutorials. So sit down somebody who hasn't used your plugin before and watch them go through your tutorial. Where are they getting stuck? Where are they getting confused? Then go back and fix your tutorial. And that's going to save you all kinds of time later on where you don't have to provide support for all the people that might be getting stuck in that same space. So as far as your UX testing, remember again that you have two markets. So you want to test with developers and you want to test with the end user or your players. So to give you an example, using Veemix, we paper prototype just about everything as far as the user's experience from start to finish. So where would the buttons be? What do they click on to bring up this menu or that menu? We paper prototyped our databases and our website. We planned it all out on paper before we did any coding at all. Then we usability tested the website and the networking components that came along with it before we went and built our alpha. Right now, we're testing our beta, so anybody can go to our website, download it for free, and provide feedback on the beta as well for at least a few more weeks. Just to give you an example then of how we changed things from our alpha to our beta, if you look at the first screen, we had all kinds of buttons on the screen to start with. And as we moved towards our beta, we found that we could hide a lot of that functionality and only have users call it up when they want it. That also frees up a lot of space for the developer's GUI. We did a lot of usability testing using both specific and open-ended questions. So sometimes we had a very specific question, like we have a custom V gesture on screen. We wanted to make sure that that wasn't going to interfere with anybody's game controls. So we had players drawing out all kinds of different sizes of Vs, seeing did that interfere with any of the functionality of the gameplay mechanics. OK, I'll turn it over to Alex now, who can give you some of the details about the development process for Unity plugins.
Thanks. Well, first of all, thanks for coming to our session. This is my first Unite, and the last few days have been really awesome, seeing all the cool things that people are doing with Unity. So I'm supposed to talk about building a plugin now, so let's jump right in. Has anyone built a plugin themselves here? Lots of people are using them. A couple of hands. Great. This one. Well, I'm going to share a few of the tricks that I came across when working on the Veemix plugin. This was my first attempt at building a plugin for the asset store, and the gestation period for Veemix was a little over 6 months, and that could roughly be divided into 3 stages. The first stage was learning how to build a Unity project that could interface with Objective-C code. So we wanted to handle the collision detection for tagged areas with Unity and call up or queue up songs and display and change the UI based on these collisions. The next stage was more about working on the iPod library integration and the audio playback and refining the plugin UI. And the last stage, the last month or so before we decided to start the beta period, was, well, about doing bug fixes, but also there's a networking component with the plugin where it communicates with a web server to share playlists. That was something that we had developed previously to starting the Unity iOS plugin. So I found that the plugin development really got exciting around the second stage. And once we had a grasp on how to call Objective-C methods from Unity and pass things back and forth, it really opened up the whole iOS SDK for us to play and experiment with in Unity. And we knew that we wanted to use the iPod library. We also soon decided after starting to handle audio playback with iOS frameworks. And eventually, we replaced our UI that we had created in Unity with an Objective-C implementation. So you should anticipate that your code should, or may take different paths as your plugin takes shape. Another example of this is with our V gesture, which we initially implemented using iOS gesture recognizer classes. We found that that was interfering with the rest of our plugin UI, so we rebuilt the whole thing in C#. But getting to this point requires you to make some decisions about what parts of your plugin can be done in Unity and what you need to build in native code. So you should have some questions in your mind as you're starting out. are you testing with the iOS simulator or with the device SDK? You need to consider that certain aspects of the iOS SDK require a device. So in our case, that's the iPod library. But if you're using things like the camera or location services, that won't work well on a simulator. You need to use the device. You need to think about how far back you're willing to support in terms of iOS versions and the form factors. If your plugin will work on iPhones and iPods, or are you going to do iPads as well? So deciding these early questions kind of forms the groundwork of the plugin development process. Of course, error messages. If there's any issue with your native code interface, that's something Unity will let you know in its console. But once you're actually deploying to the device or testing in the simulator, you want to be paying attention to the Xcode console. Something that's often overlooked is Unity development builds. This is sort of a verbose mode. Logs a whole lot more to the console. We ended up solving a bug with this when we dropped Veemix into AngryBots the first time. We found it was crashing on first launch, but would run fine on subsequent launches. It turns out to be a null reference exception. You've run into that. And we tracked that down with a development build. Once we knew what was happening, it was easy to apply a fix. So the native code in your project has to live in a plugins folder in your Unity project when you build your player. But Unity generates an Xcode project. When you build the player, it doesn't automatically add your native code or other resources to that new Xcode project. Additionally, your project's target might need to be linked to other iOS libraries. You may need to set compiler flags or other build settings. So we ran into an issue like this because we used Objective-C categories to extend iOS's AV audio player class. We did this because we wanted to be able to crossfade between songs as they changed. But when we used the categories in the static library, we were getting crashes. We solved this with a compiler flag that force loads all the objects that define that category. So you can see how easily a developer would get frustrated at having to apply these changes to the project each time they want to test something new with their game. We certainly got frustrated at having to do this during the development process. And of course, Unity developers, they're interested in creating games and not performing repetitive tasks. So we managed to automate a lot of these steps using the post-process build player script. And so Unity looks for the script in the editor folder in your Unity project, and it executes, like the name suggests, at the end of building the player. In the case of our iOS plugin, provides the ability to add your native code and resources to the newly generated Xcode project. You can link your required iOS frameworks if there are more beyond the default ones, set compiler flags, build settings, etc. So what's great about this is it takes care of a number of potentially confusing steps so that the developer doesn't have to. And another bonus is if you're using plugins, more than one plugin, perhaps from different sources, you can chain these post-process build player scripts together. So we really wanted to make Veemix easy to integrate into a game. We started along this path with the post-process build player script. We also used reusable classes for tagging areas within the game for song selection. And we put all of our code into a Unity package file, which includes an example scene, so the developers have something to play with right out of the box. And the entire Veemix plugin requires 2 game objects be added to your scene before you can start tagging areas within the game. I think it's a good idea to build the bulk of or to build your plugin, I should say, with the bulk of the heavy lifting out of sight, game developers should be able to use a few high-level scripts to achieve their goals. So you also want to consider how to package your plugin code. We chose to compile the native code into an iOS static library and distribute that for free, mainly because we think it would be simpler from a developer's point of view to integrate into a project. Unity Asset Store gives you an end-user license agreement for all assets, and in certain circumstances you can define your own terms. For example, if you're giving your asset away for free like we are. So kind of the last thing to consider, especially if you have a complex plugin, it's worth building a demo game and submitting that to the App Store to ensure that it passes Apple's approval processes. You certainly don't want to release a plugin and find out in a few weeks that games using it are getting rejected from the App Store. That will give you a lot of one-star reviews on the Asset Store. I'm going to pass it back to Karen now, who's going to talk more about selling your plugin.
Okay, selling your plugin is not as simple as just throwing it on the Asset Store and crossing your fingers, although you certainly might get lucky. The Unity Asset Store can help you with your pricing scheme. They actually have some pricing guidelines online. They may also help you by recommending a price if they think the price you initially set is way off the mark. We did a quick survey of the current top 10 and found the average price is about $40, but that includes everything from very sort of low-level effects to much more complex plugins. So you can change the price also at any time. So if you come in too high or too low, you can actually adjust that later on. One thing to think about when you're pricing is factoring in support into your price. If you're spending 2 or 3 hours with every customer, then you need to think about how much that's costing you in terms of your time. So consider a support pricing scheme. But also, of course, remember to build lots of tutorials in many formats that helps you to cut down the amount of support that you have to provide. As far as marketing, I think plugins now, as with indie games and other apps, as I said, it's no longer enough to just put it out there and hope that people find you. You actually have to do some marketing. There's lots of different ways you can market your plugin. I think it's useful to use sort of more conventional ways as well as to try and get creative as well. And something I think is often overlooked is to get a good graphic designer. I bet I'm not the only person that goes to the Asset Store and clicks on the plugins with the nicest logos first, right? Same goes for your website. You know, any sort of graphics or spelling, or it all represents you and your business. When I buy a plugin, I want something that says, hey, this person pays attention to detail. I don't want something that is a mess. So for Veemix, we're giving our plugin away free. We're thinking about maybe we'll have a premium model later. Same with support. Our support is free, and if it becomes overwhelming, then we might offer some kind of paid support system later. We've been using social networks and web. I mean, we're still in our beta, but we sent out one press release just to let people know about our beta. To give you an idea of how that worked out, it got picked up by 4 other websites, including Gamasutra. And then it got talked about on blogs. A few other articles came out on blogs. So it was a handful of response, really, that we weren't even expecting from a single press release. But we want to reach out to a lot more people, of course. We have a secret plan that should be coming out in about a week or so that we hope is going to help people sort of sit up and take notice. But I think the important thing to remember here is that your marketing really takes as much time as your development if you want to be a success. You have to factor in all of this time into pushing that product out and letting people know about it. So let's wrap it up. There's 3 basic stages to putting a plugin together. The first one is your prototyping phase, where you're doing your market research. You're going through a number of iterative processes, prototyping. Your second stage is your development, and your third stage is your marketing. And each of these take about the same amount of time. So you can factor that into your game development. If you're making a game, you can actually push out plugins as you're making your game over the year or 2 years that you're putting into your game. And you can think about putting in some of that time into creating plugins from that code as well. We think that there's lots of opportunities for revenue in plugins. Unity has over 2 million developers now. That's an awful big market for us to be able to reach out to. And just to reiterate, it helps to take some of the risk and costs away from your game development. If you can think about your game code in terms of modular sections that you might be able to turn into a plugin, or if there's some idea that is unique to your game that you can push out to other users as well through plugins. And finally, I'd say don't stop at the release. If your plugin's a success, then put more time into developing and advancing that, keeping it up to date, and updating it as you go along. You're free to check out Veemix. You can download it for free from our website. We would love to hear from you. And just since it is Friday and we're coming sort of to the end of the conference, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank our conference organizers and all of the tech support we've had this week. It's been a fantastic conference. And thank all of you for attending today. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Everybody wants lunch. OK, thanks.
Thank you.